Good afternoon. It is afternoon. It's Sunday afternoon in the middle of May 2022. And today I am going to follow a thread through three books that I recently read, prompted first by this book, Alvarez, autobiography. There's an anecdote he gives in here which sparked an idea which led me to this book, Messiaen the Theologian, edited by Andrew Shenton. And Mr. Shenton, Dr. Shenton, Professor Shenton, has an essay in here on the quartets of TS Eliot and Messiaen. And then from there, the third book, a study on Dzogchen teachings by Toku Urgyen Rinpoche. So this idea of almost like a mind map, where the music study that we're doing here, in this case the study of Messiaen's musical techniques, leads to, prompts, suggests a whole bunch of other connections, ideas, this sort of a neural pattern around the music, prompted by the music, prompted by the study of the music. And it's always in the forefront of my ideas as I'm thinking about these videos that the study of music is essentially the same as the study of what it is to be a human. And the music of Messiaen is a particularly fine and profound use case for initial exploration of music that leads to a broader study of humanity. And the mechanism that I've been using for that study has been a chapter-by-chapter read-through of his book, Techniques in My Musical Language. Now, those of you who have been following along laboriously, and much gratitude to you, will know that we're at a point in that book where the next set of chapters deals with Messiaen's modes. And it's probably the piece of information that anybody coming to these videos is really looking for. The idea of modes, Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, is really the key word that attracts people to these videos. So I want to do justice to the material, and I'm thinking of dropping like 8 videos at once, or one really long video that's broken up into 8 chapters, where each chapter or video deals with one of the modes, with a bit of context around it, and then brings in another set of information that may not be necessarily closely related to the mode, but so for example, talk about the first mode, talk about how it's constructed, but I think it's interesting to think about what a mode is in general. And I recall from my distant past as a graduate student studying some musicology that there's a great deal of very useful and interesting information about medieval church modes and how they were notated and what they were considered, what a mode was. And that then leads into the monks at Salem and the sort of revival of chant in France in the 19th century that was absolutely seminal to the way that Messiaen thought about his composition. So I want to tie all that together, and I don't want to do it in an unthinking way. And I do tend to improvise some of these videos, and I don't necessarily want to do that with this material. So at the very least, I'm working on a set of outlines for these videos, and then in the meantime, while I'm putting that together, because whether they come out as individual videos or whether they come out as a single video, I want there to be some structure. I may even script some of it. But in the meantime, I'm thinking a lot about time within music and within Messiaen. In the last video, I talked a little bit about the word eternity and the word sempiternity, and the difference between the idea of a never-ending duration of time, as opposed to an experience that is outside of time. So go back and check that video out, because it's a good video. So where do I begin? I was reading Alvarez. I've had this book on my stack of books to read for a couple of years. I forget why I picked it up. Alvarez was the poetry critic for the Observer newspaper in Britain in the 60s up into the 70s. I think he was there for a decade. And he was an early advocate for a lot of what I consider to be some of the most important and meaningful poetry written in that time. So American poets like Robert Lowell, Berryman, and then Sylvia Plath, who Alvarez knew. Alvarez was publishing her poems shortly before she died, and played a real role in getting those late poems into the public, published, and published, recognized in a way that allowed people to see their true magisterial nature. I'm thinking of poems like Lady Lazarus or Daddy, the Ariel poems. So Alvarez is a crucial figure in the history and publishing of those poems by Sylvia Plath, and that's where I saw him first. A couple of video interviews, where he talks about that time and his friendship and professional relationship with Plath and with Ted Hughes and with that whole dynamic. He has a book called The Savage God about suicide, his own suicide attempt, and Sylvia Plath. So I read that book, and along the way saw this and picked it up. It's his autobiography. It's a story of his childhood through his adulthood. I think he writes this when he's in his early 70s. So it truly is a reflection on his entire life. And I bought it and then set it aside because I don't know, I'm always worried when I have books that I'm looking forward to that at the end of it I will be disappointed. Alvarez, though, is a fantastic writer. And I'm definitely going to go back and reread The Savage God, having read this. But look at this. He was a rock climber. He wrote books. He wrote some poetry. He was a fine critic, good editor by all accounts, and had a very interesting life as a child during the Blitz in London. That sort of dates him. So the generation of the 50s. And again, his advocacy for poets like Plath, but also Robert Lowell. I mean, some of these are poets that just very important in my. Some of those poets and their poems are companions to my existence. And think about the poems and poets that are equal companions in your life, whether or not they are consciously there. We have language that comes to us from our readings of poetry that is different from our readings of novels or autobiographies or biographies, histories, or what have you. There's something about the poetic construct that sort of sidles into the aura around us. And one of the things that first drew me to Plath's poetry was, regardless of what it was, it felt like you were jumping into the sort of the aesthetic halo around us all. It made me aware of the sort of fragments of memory and desire, fantasies, fears that float around us like jet trail. that we produce this stuff. And Plath's poetry really resides in that space and makes that space apparent. So Alvarez is talking about his time at Oxford, and as an English or a student of English literature, sort of a complex dynamic about where that study fit in the hierarchy of the university, and where he fit, or where critics fit in culture and what it was to be a critic. And at this time, there was a shift in what criticism meant. Think of it this way, that you can have criticism kind of like what I do, which is an interaction with a piece of art, music, poetry, and without necessarily placing that work of art into any other context except the interaction that I, as the critic, I, as the engaged party, is having, with an intent to provide an avenue for you who either already are familiar with the piece and maybe are just interested in thinking about it differently, or are learning about a piece for the first time and looking for a model of engagement. The content is secondary to the fact that there is an engagement. Right? Take that against sort of the new criticism, which was new in the 50s, where the text is taken as an artifact on its own and can be analyzed and extracted and scrutinized as a discrete unit, and that's important too. But that dynamic between the sort of the, maybe for lack of a better word, a romantic view of criticism, and then a sort of more modernist view of criticism. And I'm probably butchering the actual definition. Those of you who are critics and who are literature students and who are well versed in that dynamic, you can correct me in the comments below. But while at Oxford, Alvarez formed a student group for a forum, kind of like the debate society, but the critical society, and they brought famous critics from other universities into their space and had them speak, and then got to hang out with them. And he's talking about a critic called Empson. And there's 2 or 3 pages that I want to read to get to the key quote here. So I'm going to skim through it. Right? So far as I was concerned, says Alvarez, Empson was the incarnation of brilliance, and the critical society, that's the group that he founded at Oxford, had been founded in his honor. Naturally, he was one of the first guest speakers we invited. This was around 1951, when his reputation as a poet was at its peak, and he was briefly a cult figure. The man who was going to lead British poetry out of the booming neo-romantic wilderness of Dylan Thomas, George Barker, and Edith Sitwell. Empson was only recently back in England. Apart from a wartime stint at the BBC, he had been teaching in Japan and China since 1931, having been thrown out of Cambridge because, they said, he decorated the candles in his room with condoms. When I heard that he was living on Roslyn Hill, not far from my parents, I wrote to him immediately saying we'd be on it, etc. Oxford was full of his admirers, and we'd throw a party if he fancied one. To my astonishment, he said yes. Empson was moderately tall of stature, but his eyes were like ice, and he clearly didn't much like what he saw when we all met up in Wallace Robson's rooms. Robson was one of Alvarez's chums. I don't think it was just us, the Welcome Committee, whom he disliked, though he made it plain that he couldn't imagine what he was doing in Oxford. The distaste he exuded was beyond that, It was like a spell of bad weather, steady and impartial. He disliked everybody, hated being back in England, and seemed to dread the prospect of going to Sheffield, where he was soon to be installed as professor. He didn't cheer up until we started uncorking the wine, which I'd laid on in great quantities. His talk to the society was a more or less impenetrable section of his book in progress, The Structure of Complex Words, which he read without much conviction from a dog-eared manuscript. After it was over, we trooped back to Wallace's rooms and clustered around him while he lashed into the Messiaen, the wine, waiting for some brilliant remark that would redeem the boredom and disappointment. So getting the vibe here reminds me a little bit of the Smith songs. Oh, those alcoholic afternoons we spent in your rooms, they meant more to me than any living thing on earth. Sorry, Morrissey. I'm sorry, Morrissey, that you are the dickhead you are now, but your music was enormously important when I was an undergraduate at Bates College, not at Oxford. Empson, after all, was no ordinary academic. 7 Types was full of elaborate witticisms which we knew by heart and quoted remorselessly to our board tutors. And the Critical Society had even been founded in honor of one of them. Critics, as barking dogs, are of 2 sorts: those who merely relieve themselves against the flower of beauty, and those, less continent, who afterwards scratch it up. It seemed unjust that he would not deign to throw us some scrap as a reward for our puppyish devotion. All right, so now we're in the quotes of. Hopefully that's all been worthwhile to get to. It's a long walk, I think, is what people say. It's a long walk, but hopefully it's worth it. It was a long wait. Around 2 in the morning, when we were all drunk and exhausted, Empson stretched back on Wallace's sofa and pronounced in his roller coaster accents, when Eliot in the 4 quartets says, time past and time present are both perhaps present in time future, he's making a grammatical statement. What he's really saying is the future perfect equals the ablative absolute. There it was, the aphorism we had been waiting for, straight from the horse's mouth and not yet in print. It almost made our misery worthwhile. The future perfect equals the ablative absolute. Time present. So, the 4 quartets. I thought that was fantastic. And so does Alvarez, obviously, and he's absolutely right. Time past and time present are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. That is from the opening of Burnt Norton, which is the first of the 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot, written roughly contemporaneous with Messiaen's quartet for the end of time. And although there's 0 evidence that they are connected, related, that Messiaen and or Eliot knew either or each of the others, they both articulate, one in poetry, verse, one in music and sound, the idea that there is a still point. That's a word Eliot uses later in the 4 quartets. Still point of time's turning. Messiaen, with his musical constructs, with his musical techniques, deliberately creates an environment or a phenomenon or an experience of stasis. These patterns of non-retrogradable rhythm intersected with modes of limited transposition form this sort of nexus, and that nexus is where we are positioned, and it is as if through that nexus is a portal or pointings to an experience that transcends the duration of time. I'm more firmly located on the side of thinking that the end of time does not refer to unending duration. Although some of the patterns that Messiaen suggests in his music could unfold to an enormous duration. And what we hear is a snippet of a pattern that, if allowed to continue, if we knew how it began and how it would end, would take an awful long time, an eternity. My experience is that it propels me beyond the end of time is not the end of things. It is not the end of unfolding. It is a position sort of off to the side of time. Shenton says this more clearly. He said, in fact, Messiaen sought to manipulate time through many specific musical techniques, including repetitive forms, symmetrical units in mosaic patterns, isorhythmic motets, palindromes, and symmetrical patterns, unity of atmosphere, avoidance of conflict, neutralized dissonance, non-functional harmony, right? The idea that harmony suggests a progression does not exist in Messiaen. He has different cadential gestures. He has a different structure of melody that resides within these frameworks of modes of limited transposition, for example. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. I've got to pull my book up to remember because I'm not a grammatician. The future perfect equals the ablative absolute. That may be the title of this video. The future perfect equals the ablative absolute. So there's a wonderful synchronicity or syncretic experience by joining these two works of art together, the TS Eliot quartets, 4 quartets, and the Messiaen quartet. That syncretic phenomenon transcends the moment. It is a case where the study of a score, the study of a poem, is separate from the experience of the poem and the experience of the music, because both are by nature time bound. We read and absorb through time, and we listen and experience through time. But when we look at the score, we look at the text, and particularly when we have memorized and drawn those together, then they cease to be separate works of art. They become instead that neural pattern that I talked about at the beginning, that set of ripples, and the interference pattern of those ripples. Now I have 2 pebbles dropped into the pond. I have the poem and I have the music. But the shared element is my consciousness and my reception of those, and your reception now of that conjunction. And the idea that these experiences unfold within consciousness is absolutely key to the understanding of Dzogchen, which is sort of the natural state meditation, familiar from Tibetan Buddhism, and without pretending to give an idea, anything more than just a soundbite of what that means. You can think of one approach for meditation as a series of distinct, disciplined practices to shape the behavior of the mind, to focus the mind through concentration on the breath, or to renounce certain activities and practices, in order that the karma and the obscurations of the self subside, and one achieves enlightenment. One is free from craving, one is free from the karmic obscuration. On the other hand is the sort of immediate Mahamudra, Dzogchen, natural state, that all of that is present, and it is simply a shift, a move in our awareness that allows us to see that thought, consciousness, or thought ideas, even the meditation practice itself, is a concrescence within consciousness, and that there is this sort of innate, awake awareness that is the base of our experience, the base of our natural state. And whether it's hearing my voice now, or reading a poem, or thinking about the creative aesthetic halo that is highlighted in reading Plath's poetry, it is the waves on the ocean of that consciousness. And as I was rereading this essay, and thinking about putting this together, I was finishing up this book, Rainbow Painting, which is a wonderful introduction to some of those concepts, very clear articulation of the teachings and pointing out some of that nature of mind. And I highlighted this sentence. At the moment of death, time does not change. Experiences change. Time here means that there is no real death that occurs because our innate nature is beyond time. So I really mean this. This is really why I do this. I think that the study of music and the experience of music compels a confrontation with our mortality through our senses, through our mind, through our reckoning with the memories and thoughts that the music evokes. And when we study the nature of the music, we are studying the nature of our thought. And when we study music and poetry that points beyond time, it is an assist to the recognition of our own nature of, like he says here, our innate nature is beyond time. Time here means there is no real death. Time does not change. Experiences change. The underlying phenomena doesn't change. The music changes. Music rides on the waves of our perception. Music articulates the unfolding of time. Time and our perception do not change. The substance on the surface changes. And when we have a composer like Messiaen, who creates these constructs that just kind of latch onto that, we have an opportunity to see. For Messiaen, that's the liturgy. It is the mystery of Catholicism. It's the mystery of Christ. My framework is Buddhist. Your framework could be entirely non-secular, entirely atheistic. It could be entirely within a different construct. But I have a sense that this notion of time and the interweaving of present, past, and future beyond time is central to all of our experiences. Anyway, again, thank you for 30 minutes. That's good. Like, subscribe, share, all that stuff. Drop me a note, leave a comment. I love hearing emails back and forth, and I really do promise that I will do more than one a month. I just get wrapped up and worried that, I don't know. Well, like everybody who does YouTube, I worry that it's not worth it. But look, this is fun. So please, if you have a question, fire away. And otherwise I will be back hopefully within a week or two. And over the summer, by the end of the summer, by September, we'll have the modal stuff. In the meantime, more of this kind of stuff coming along.